Chapter 17. Soft shades of pink colored the sky as I crept into the hall. I had just enough time to grab some food before Mama got up to make breakfast. I didn't bother turning lights on as I went, so it surprised me to see the kitchen table glowing in the refrigerator light. "Bree?" Thomas startled, standing erect and softly closing the refrigerator door. He was already dressed for the day in jeans and an old rock and roll band t-shirt and a pair of worn black boots. I didn't expect anyone else to be up. He examined my shorty pajamas and the soft light coming through the window before adding milk to his coffee. "Don't worry, I'm not staying," I said, turning back on my heels. "I'm headed out anyway." He stopped me in my tracks. "Look," we both said at the same time. I can't keep doing this," I started. "I'm leaving," he interrupted, placing the milk back in the fridge. "What?" My chest constricted at his words. But wasn't that what I wanted? Him leaving was going to be my suggestion, but hearing it from his lips sounded wrong. It suddenly struck me how much I didn't want him to leave. Taking a sip of coffee as he leaned against the counter, he added, "I heard there's a horse farm a few miles from here looking for help. Does Daddy know?" He nodded, taking another sip of coffee before pouring the rest down the sink. "Told him last night." His voice was much calmer now. All the anger in his eyes appeared resolved. He understood. I didn't know what to say. This was best. It had to be better than trying to avoid him for the next several weeks in my own house. I leaned against the counter across from him, no longer worried about food. Apparently, all mine soon enough. He watched me intently another long minute before silently reaching for the doorknob. The back door shut quietly behind him. I had to grip the counter as the empty feeling, the one that had disappeared the moment I'd heard his voice at Jenny's party, reared its ugly head again. Sitting at the table, I put my head in my hands, watching through my fingers as the sun continued to brighten the sunflowers on the curtains, sending light through the front rooms. I could picture Thomas here now, his laughter floating in from the living room and his face across from me at the table. These weren't the faded memories I'd patched together from years past. These pictures were fresh and would hurt deeper when he left. Why did he have this effect on me? Why could he never leave me whole, the way he found me? Like that stupid fence, I was broken when he got here, and I'd be broken when he left. I nearly jumped out of my skin when the back door slammed loudly against the wall. Thomas's face was beet red, his breath heavy from running. He started past me, his clothes leaving a wet trail, but I grabbed his arm. He shook out of my grasp and yelled up the stairs for Daddy. "What is it?" His eyes were wild as they darted up the stairs to the door and back. Spinning on his heels, he started back through the kitchen. "Thomas!" "It's the coyotes." The emptiness in his voice sent a chill through me. Something bad had happened. Daddy, still pulling his shirt into place, bypassed us both, the screen slamming behind him. "Oh no, did they get one of the chickens?" I asked, reaching around Thomas as he stood transfixed in front of the back door for my boots. "Not this time," he said, nervously glancing back toward the chicken coop. But if it wasn't the chickens, why was he looking in that direction? The only other animals... "The horses," I said, pushing my way through him and taking the slick steps 2 at a time. "You don't want to go out there, Breland," he said, close on my heels, grabbing my arm. "Just wait inside." I twisted out of his hands and nearly fell before sprinting across the yard. The barn was empty, every stall. It looked like the horses had gotten out. They'd done that before. Breathing a sigh of relief, I turned to help Daddy. Thomas probably had him worked up into a panic over nothing. Then I saw the blood. The bright red trail started in Addie's stall and went out the double doors. "Catch her!" Daddy yelled to Thomas, but I was already sprinting, the cool morning dew brushing my legs as I cleared the field. Not Addie. It couldn't be Addie. Not my horse. The blood had to be from the coyotes. Addie probably got a good kick at one of them. She probably knocked it on the rake or something. I was well into the trees before I stopped, listening for movement. All I could hear was Thomas, closing in on me quickly. I took off before he could catch me and headed to the water. That's where we'd found the horses before. I could almost hear the water when I tripped, landing on the soggy pine needles. I pushed back to my feet, ready to dart away from Thomas when I heard her whimper. It was Addie. She was lying on her side. Even in the darkness of the overhanging trees, I could see her leg was in bad shape. I ran to her head, rubbing her thick mane. "It's okay, Addie," I soothed through the tears that streamed down my nose and onto my face. "I'm here now. It's going to be okay." "Where's she hurt?" Thomas demanded, coming up behind me and kneeling at her opposite side. Her leg, I sniffed. It's hard to tell where else. There's so much blood. Hold her head, he said, pulling his shirt over his head. I'm going to soak up some of this blood and see how bad it is. I was prepared for her to jerk or to kick at him, and when she didn't, I lost it. She had to be pretty bad off to let him touch her like that and not move. He pressed up higher, and I turned my head. I couldn't bear to look in her eyes. She was in pain, and there was nothing I could do. Suddenly, there were gunshots and voices in front of us. Katie's dad. Marshall? His voice called in our direction. No, Thomas called back. It's Thomas. Come quick, he said. I've got one of them, but they've driven one of the horses into the water. I looked at Thomas, panicked, as his eyes moved from me to Addie. Go! One final look to my face, and he reluctantly showed me where to apply pressure to the wound before sprinting toward the riverbed. I took his place at Addie's leg, tying his shirt around it, but I could see it wasn't going to do any good. The blood was a pool beneath her, soaking through the cotton faster than I could wrap the shirt. As I rubbed through the matted hair, she stopped moving. Addie, I said, darting to her head, but she was already gone, her eyes fixed in the direction Thomas had disappeared. Oh no, Addie, I cried into her mane. Breland, Thomas called. Go get your daddy, quick! I ran toward the overflowing river, the water rushing quickly downstream. Thomas had managed to get a grip on Allendale, but he was losing his footing. The mud was sinking in around his boot, up to his knee already. Mr. Johnson was on the other side trying to get the other horses out of the mud before they met the same fate. Just let him go, Mr. Johnson yelled. You'll get yourself drowned, son. I've got him, Thomas said through gritted teeth. Then his boot slipped. The branch holding his foot snapped like a twig under the pressure, and he was gone. The force of Thomas's body shoved Allendale close enough to the bank to gain traction with his front legs. Without thinking, I dove into the water. The rapid current took me by surprise. The floods had made it much more forceful. I flailed my arms, trying to keep my head above water. I could see Thomas several yards in front of me. It didn't look like he was swimming anymore, like the muddy water was washing his body away instead. I immediately thought of Addie, lying there lifeless. That wasn't going to happen to Thomas. I fought harder, forcing my arms to plunge ahead, racing the current instead of being carried. When I looked up again, he was within reach. I wrapped my arm across his back and tried to turn him over. It was nearly impossible to turn his head and keep my legs moving at the same time, but somehow I managed to get his face out of the water. Grab the rope, Mr. Johnson yelled, stretching over the muddied bank. I hadn't realized he'd been running beside us. Daddy was there too, watching in horror and trying to get his footing on the muddied river bank. No! Mr. Johnson and I both yelled at him at the same time. I reached for the rope, but I couldn't get it and keep Thomas's mouth out of the water. He was too heavy. It was all I could do to keep us above the surface. I'm going to throw it again, Breland. Get ready, Mr. Johnson called. Thomas's skin was slippery from the muddied water. I had to use my nails to grip him. The rope was behind me before I saw it. I pushed back with all my might, but I just couldn't get it without letting go. I can't! I gritted my teeth. Daddy was lying on the ground, his face drawn tight as his arm stretched from my hand. Get Thomas first, I insisted in gasps. He looked horrified. Breland, get my hand now! Not until you get Thomas out, I said, panicked, pleading as more water rushed into my ears and covered my mouth. Kicking harder, I managed. He's not breathing. I can't hold him much longer. Daddy's face was boiling, but he did what I asked. I towed Thomas as close as I could manage before the rock I was standing on turned, and I lost my footing. Luckily, he'd managed to get a hand under Thomas's arm. It took Daddy and Mr. Johnson to pull him out. Daddy's hand was back in a flash, never stopping to check Thomas. I took it this time, and he heaved me out of the water with more force than necessary. He hugged me tightly to his chest, but I pulled away and ran to Thomas. Thomas's face was a bluish color that made my knees buckle. Mr. Johnson was already doing mouth-to-mouth. Thomas's cold fingers pressed tightly between mine as I begged God not to take him from me again. Not this way. Breathe, Thomas, breathe, I begged him. Katie's dad fell back on his knees. I looked at him half mad, ready to take his place when I heard Thomas call. My heart started beating again. I lifted Thomas's head into my lap. Oh, thank you, God, thank you, I repeated breathlessly. By now, Daddy was hovering over us. He's okay, I said, shifting my weight to the other leg when Thomas sat up and feeling the piercing pain in my knee. My legs were so discolored with red mud it was hard to tell if there was blood. I tried to get back to my feet, but the pain was too much. I sank back to the ground and watched as Daddy worked with Thomas. Thomas's voice was gruff, but he sounded more like himself now. He didn't like being fussed over and kept pushing Daddy's hand away when he tried to check the gashes on his chest. They looked bad, which made me feel even worse. There were 5 of them. I glanced down at my nails, all evidence of his skin washed away with the river. "You hit your head going in," Mr. Johnson was telling Thomas, breathing heavily as he leaned against a massive tree trunk. "I was on my way in after you, but Breland beat me to it. That girl saved your life, son." He paused to glare at me. "She had me scared to death, her head like a bobber on a fishing line. It was the good Lord that helped her catch you. I still don't know how she managed to tow you in." "She's a little thing, but she's strong," Daddy spoke up proudly, able to gloat a little now that I was safely on the bank. They were all staring at me like I'd grown 3 heads, but it was Thomas I couldn't take my eyes from. When it was clear Thomas was going to be okay, Mr. Johnson ushered John Tyler and the boys who'd shown up after the excitement was over back to their house, and then came back to help Daddy get the horses to the barn. Thomas was on his feet now, though he still looked like he might faint any second. "Are you out of your mind?" he croaked, his throat clearly raw from the water as he reached for my hand. "You could have drowned, Breland. What the hell were you thinking?" Not exactly the words I expected. I pushed against the ground to get up, but the pressure on my knee was too much, even with his help. "I was thinking I didn't want you to die," I said sharply, wincing in pain. "You're hurt," he said, alarmed, his brow furrowing as he stooped down in front of me. I crossed my arms over my soaked chest. "Don't worry about it. Daddy will be back in a few minutes." "Where?" he insisted, swatting mosquitoes away from the blood on his chest. "It's just my knee," I said dismissively. "I must have hit it when I dove in." I was determined not to let him help me, but he already had my leg in his hands. It looked bad, worse than I thought. It was already swelling. The purple color was dark, almost black in places, like a ripe avocado. "You busted it up pretty good." He shook his head with a frown. "If you'd have just listened to me." "Can you walk on it?" If I'd listened to him, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The only conversation he'd be having would be with St. Peter. "It's not your problem," I said stubbornly, pushing against his mud-streaked shoulders as his arms reached beneath my knees. The wound on his chest started bleeding again when he scooped me up. "Would you rather sit here and feed the mosquitoes?" "I'd rather do that than be stuck with you," I shot back. "Come to think of it, I haven't tried crawling. Put me down. 10 minutes ago you risked your life to save me, and now you can't stand me. You really should make up your mind." His lips mashed together as he towed me closer to the house. "I'm starting to rethink my decision," I said evenly, my nails pushing into his shoulder. "Are you going to give me a matching scar for the other side?" I scoffed. Was he seriously complaining about how I'd saved his life? "Are you sure you weren't trying to kill me?" he asked, no humor in his voice. "If the water hadn't taken care of me, bleeding to death would?" Addie, I thought suddenly. He'd kept me talking until we'd passed her body. I tried to look back, but he sped up. "I'll bury her," he said, the edge gone from his voice.